The sheer violence of the crime scene suggested a cartel hit, an assassination designed to send a brutal, unmistakable message. 14 shotgun blasts shattered the quiet of Elm Drive in Beverly Hills on August 20, 1989, leaving wealthy entertainment executive Jose Menendez and his wife Kitty dead in their living room. The brutality was so extreme, the destruction so absolute, that initial investigators immediately looked outward. They searched for enemies in the cutthroat worlds of corporate music and organized crime, assuming such savagery could only be the work of professional killers. But the true perpetrators were not faceless assassins. They were the grieving sons who made the hysterical 911 call. Lyle and Erik Menendez had executed their parents, a fact they would eventually admit in a Los Angeles courtroom. The realization that the ultimate threat came from inside the house instantly transformed the investigation. It shifted the focus from a sprawling hunt for unknown killers to a microscopic, desperate search for a motive within a family that appeared to have everything. The prosecution's initial narrative was built on a foundation of spectacular greed. In the months following the arraignment, the formal reading of the criminal charges in open court, investigators documented the brothers embarking on a lavish, almost manic spending spree. They squandered roughly $700,000 on Rolex watches, luxury cars, high-end real estate, and failing business ventures. To the district attorney's office, this financial hemorrhage was the definitive motive. It was the cold, calculating reason for patricide, a lethal shortcut to a massive inheritance. The state's case solidified when the brothers' psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel, became a pivotal and highly controversial figure. Detectives issued a subpoena, a legal writ ordering the production of evidence under penalty of law to seize audio tapes from the doctor's office. On these recordings, the brothers could be heard confessing to the murders during private therapy sessions. The prosecution intended to use these tapes as the ultimate smoking gun, confident that the chilling recorded admissions would secure swift convictions and bypass the need for circumstantial evidence. However, the defense fiercely contested the admissibility of the tapes, sparking a massive pre-trial legal battle over doctor-patient privilege. The fight hinged on a specific legal exemption which states that confidentiality is broken if a patient poses an imminent threat to others. The court ultimately ruled that because the brothers had allegedly threatened the psychologist himself, the tapes could be introduced as evidence. The prosecution had their confession, but the defense was already preparing a counteroffensive that would upend the entire trajectory of the trial. The tapes revealed a fractured psychological state, prompting a profound shift in how the brothers were presented to the world. The facade of the carefree, wealthy Beverly Hills heirs was stripped away, replaced by a narrative of deep, systemic familial dysfunction. The defense team realized that simply denying the murders was impossible. They had to explain the unimaginable. They had to construct a narrative that made patricide seem not like an act of greed, but an act of desperate survival. Facing insurmountable evidence of the act itself, lead defense attorney Leslie Abramson orchestrated a profound tactical pivot. She introduced an affirmative defense rooted in the concept of imperfect self-defense. This complex legal doctrine argues that a defendant killed due to an honest, albeit unreasonable belief that their own life was in immediate danger. If successful, this strategy could negate the element of malice aforethought, potentially reducing a first-degree murder charge to voluntary manslaughter and saving the brothers from the death penalty. Abramson's strategy required dismantling the meticulously crafted public image of the Menendez family. She painted a harrowing portrait of the household as a theater of horrors, alleging that Jose Menendez subjected his sons to years of severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Kitty Menendez was depicted as a complicit, broken bystander who enabled the torment. The defense argued that the brothers did not kill for an inheritance, but acted out of a primal desperation, genuinely believing their parents were planning to murder them to prevent the family's dark secrets from surfacing. When the first trial commenced in 1993, the courtroom mechanics were uniquely complex and highly experimental. During voir dire, the preliminary examination of potential jurors to uncover biases, it became clear that finding an impartial panel would be nearly impossible given the intense media scrutiny. The judge opted for a rare logistical arrangement. 2 separate juries were impaneled in a single courtroom, one for Lyle and one for Erik. This was designed to prevent cross-contamination of evidence specific to each brother, while simultaneously managing the sprawling unified defense narrative. Erik Menendez took the stand, in what would become the defining moment of the proceedings. Over several grueling days of direct examination, he detailed the alleged abuse with excruciating specificity, weeping openly as he recounted a lifetime of terror behind closed doors. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the defense presented their case, attempting to prove that the extreme violence of August 1989 was the tragic, inevitable culmination of decades of unseen, unpunished torment. The prosecution countered this emotional testimony with aggressive, methodical cross-examination, attempting to expose the abuse claims as a fabricated, desperate legal fiction. Prosecutors highlighted glaring inconsistencies in the brothers' timelines. They pointed specifically to the deliberate purchase of the shotguns in San Diego days before the murders, using a stolen identity. They argued this logistical planning was undeniable proof of premeditation, framing the abuse allegations as a calculated, retroactive excuse designed to manipulate the sympathies of the jury. The dueling narratives plunged the courtroom into a state of profound psychological tension. The juries were tasked with an almost impossible burden, deciphering the absolute truth within a deeply dysfunctional family dynamic where the only other witnesses were the deceased victims. The legal threshold for reasonable doubt became hopelessly entangled with subjective interpretations of trauma, fear, and the very definition of victimhood. Jurors were forced to weigh forensic evidence against emotional devastation. In January 1994, the rigid legal system collided with the messy complexities of human psychology. Both juries announced they were hopelessly deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous decision despite weeks of deliberation. The inability to secure a verdict on either murder or manslaughter charges resulted in two separate mistrials. It was a stunning, highly publicized defeat for the prosecution and a temporary, chaotic victory for the defense team. The hung juries sent shockwaves through the American judicial landscape. The outcome demonstrated the potent, unpredictable power of the abuse defense in a modern, televised courtroom. It proved that a narrative of severe victimization could effectively neutralize overwhelming forensic evidence and taped confessions in the minds of sympathetic jurors. The trial became a national sensation, sparking intense, polarizing debates about culpability and the legal system's ability to discern truth from sophisticated manipulation. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, reeling from the public embarrassment and the failure to secure convictions, retooled their approach entirely for the retrial. The second trial, beginning in 1995, would not be a mere repetition of the first. The prosecution sought and won critical evidentiary rulings designed to strictly limit the scope of the defense's psychological narrative, aiming to strip away the emotional context that had derailed their initial case. Judge Stanley Weisberg, presiding over the retrial, fundamentally altered the battlefield with a series of strict rulings. He severely restricted the defense's ability to present a comprehensive history of the alleged abuse. The judge ruled that much of the psychological testimony was inadmissible hearsay, out-of-court statements offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. He determined that historical abuse, no matter how severe, was legally irrelevant to the immediate state of mind of the defendants at the exact moment they pulled the triggers. Leslie Abramson found her primary weapon effectively blunted. The defense was forced to navigate a legal minefield, attempting to prove imminent fear without the foundational context of the long-term trauma they argued had created that very fear. Furthermore, the judge restricted the introduction of exculpatory evidence, materials favorable to the defendant that might exonerate them or reduce their culpability, if it pertained solely to past abuse rather than an immediate, verifiable threat on the night of the murders. Stripped of its psychological counterweight, the prosecution's case in the second trial hit with devastating, unimpeded force. They focused relentlessly on the timeline, the forensic brutality of the crime scene, and the fabricated alibi the brothers initially provided to detectives. The narrative was streamlined and clinical, stripping away the emotional complexity to reveal a stark, terrifying portrait of calculated, cold-blooded murder driven entirely by financial greed and a desire for freedom from parental control. During closing arguments, the courtroom atmosphere was devoid of the chaotic ambiguity that had defined the first trial. The state characterized the brothers as privileged executioners who had simply exhausted their legal tricks. The defense, fighting against the strict evidentiary confines, made a final, desperate plea for the jury to look beyond the immediate actions and see the deeply damaged individuals behind the violence, even if the law refused to fully acknowledge them. The final fatal blow to the defense came during the formulation of jury instructions. Judge Weisberg refused to allow the jury to consider the lesser charge of manslaughter. The legal parameters were rigidly, uncompromisingly set. The jury had to choose between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or outright acquittal, the formal certification of innocence. The safety net of imperfect self-defense was entirely removed from the equation, leaving the brothers exposed to the harshest penalties of the law. On March 20, 1996, the singular jury for the retrial delivered their decision. Lyle and Erik Menendez were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with special circumstances of lying in wait and multiple murders. The strict application of legal definitions and the rigorous exclusion of historical context had triumphed over the expansive psychological narrative of the defense. The state had finally secured its victory. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The brothers were spared the death penalty, but their lives were permanently sealed behind the walls of the California Department of Corrections. The lavish lifestyle that had allegedly motivated the crimes was replaced by the stark, unyielding reality of maximum security confinement. A final, brutal end to a life of immense privilege. The Menendez trials left an indelible mark on American jurisprudence. The saga exposed the intense friction between rigid legal statutes and the nuanced, often messy realities of psychological trauma. It forced the legal system to grapple with the boundaries of victimhood and the extent to which past abuse can legally justify future violence, setting a complex precedent for how trauma is litigated, evaluated, and ultimately judged in capital cases. Decades later, the echoes of those early legal battles continue to resonate. The case remains a definitive study in the power of narrative within the courtroom, a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice is rarely a simple equation of facts. It is a complex, high-stakes theater where human psychology, legal doctrine, and the desperate instinct for survival inevitably collide, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and shattered lives.